Hey, I'm David Adelsheim. The story of Adelsheim Vineyard began in 1971. That was the year that Ginny and I decided to risk our life savings on a piece of property in Oregon's North Willamette Valley. Looking back now, we were one of just 10 families that made wine before 1980 from grapes planted on our properties in that region. To celebrate the 50th anniversary of what became our first vineyard, we wanted to tell our story. But we quickly realized that the only way to truly tell our story was to tell the stories of that entire first generation. Our winery team proposed an idea, a series of video conversations with the founders of those first 10 wineries and me. I loved it and set to work contacting my old friends. In each interview, we wanted to go beyond their widely known histories to discover who these people really were and what led them to build our uniquely collaborative, and at least from today's perspective, incredibly successful wine industry. This is our shared story. The third winery in our series is Erath Vineyards. We met up with Dick Erath on October 9, 2020, at his original vineyard property. Today it is known as Chehalem Mountain Vineyard and is owned by Geodesy Wine, Capra Vineyards. I first met Dick in April 1971 when we stopped our car in front of the rented loggage cabin where he and his family were living. We were hoping to see some wine grapes, which we'd heard had been planted in the area. And as it turned out, Dick knew where some were planted. They just weren't next to the cabin. Thanks so much for, first of all, getting us permission to come to the original vineyard that you planted. These vines were planted what year?
1969, spring of 1969.
So they're probably the third oldest, this is the third oldest site in the Willamette Valley at this point.
I think, yeah.
After Dick, after
Corey and
Dave and Chuck. Yeah.
Yeah.
When would you have started drinking wine? Would that have been?
Probably when I was about late 20s. I was in the late 27, when I was 27, 28.
So that would have been in the early 60s?
Yeah.
Mid-60s,
yeah.
something like that?
It was interesting because I had a good friend who loved wine and had a great collection of Cabernets from Napa Valley. And he went to his house once for dinner and exposed me to some wonderful older wines.
You were evolving an interest in wine as something to drink. At some point in California still, you got into home winemaking.
Right, right.
Where were the grapes coming from and what varieties?
Well, as it turns out, I had interested in photography. I'd done a lot of photography over the years. And Barney Fetzer, before he even had a winery, was selling grapes to home winemakers. And he wanted to have some brochures. So he needed photographs. So I was a photographer for his brochures. Instead of charging him money, I just took some grapes. Took him to Walnut Creek and started making wine in the garage in Walnut Creek. And that was not the first wine I made, but that was like in 66, I think, 66, 67.
Sometime soon after 66, you became interested in moving up here.
That's because in 67, I took a short course at Davis, and I was talking to Vern Singleton, the prof, in this one class we were taking on aging of wine. And I asked him about what's going on. I didn't understand why people couldn't grow grapes other places besides California. No one ever explained that to me. So I asked him about, is anything going on up north? And he said, well, there's these two guys that went through my class last year, Chuck, Corey, and Dave. Then I was interviewed at Tektronix. I drove up at harvest time. Oh, by the way, Richard Summers in the back of the class.
Oh, in Vern's class that year?
That year, he was in the back of the class, and Vern pointed him out to me, and I introduced myself, and he was very enthusiastic about someone had an interest in Oregon. He quickly gave me a bottle of wine, which I, drove back lightning speed to Walnut Creek from Davis and opened it up, and it smelled like a whiskey barrel. That's when I met Chuck. Dave was out selling books at the time. Chuck was home and spent way into like 4 o'clock in the morning talking about grapes and wine in the old house in Forest Grove. Told me about his master's thesis that talks about, the limitation on climate and all the work he'd done on that. And it was an interesting paper at the time.
Yeah. You were really a home winemaker at that point.
Right.
Was there something that pushed you to thinking that you should do something bigger than that?
Yeah, I had a walnut orchard in Walnut Creek, a small orchard, only 3 acres. And I said, I like to plant grapes, but I don't want to be a victim of somebody else's marketing company. So I said, well, let's plant grapes and make wine. I had a background in, from Davis, and then also when I was going to school, I worked in a brewery, so I had some fermentation knowledge that I garnered there.
So already before you came up here, you had the vision that this could be an occupation, not just a...
Oh yeah, I didn't. I was not going to be just a grower.
That first trip up when you were going to take grapes back from Summers, when did you start meeting others who were up here? I mean, there weren't that many at that point. It was really only...
So on the way back to California, I stopped by Summers. He was harvesting, and he let me go out and pick grapes. I picked... I think Gewürztraminer and some Pinot. Took them back to Walnut Creek and made wine. Not a lot, but whatever I could fit in the trunk of the car. Cars going down the freeway, juice is running out of the trunk. I came up ahead of the family and found a house in Beaverton to rent, which we rented for about a year. And then I found the cabin on Kingsgrade Road, because it was opposite the vineyard. You could look out the back of the cabin and see the vineyard.
But in '69, you found this place. Were you actively looking for vineyards by then?
Yes. By that time, Tech had a flying club. We owned our own aircraft. I'd pour over U.S. Coast and geodetic maps and say, okay, these look like potential sites. Go up in a plane and look at them from the air. And then they looked pretty good from the air. Then the next step was to get in a family car on the weekends and go out and start knocking on doors. I found out early on you don't ask a farmer, will you sell me some land? That kind of gets them ruffled. You have to say, do you know anything around here that might be for sale? And so that's how I got Mrs. Dopp. I mean, I came back a couple weeks later, and she said, well, maybe I'll sell you some land.
But when you arrived...
It was a walnut orchard.
It was
a walnut orchard that had been hit by the Columbus Day storm. So when I bought this place, it was just all these terrible walnut trees everywhere.
Was that 68 when you bought it?
Yeah, 68 when I bought it.
I mean, it sounds like so far this was pretty much you and maybe some volunteers from Tech, your family, that were planting these original vines and starting this up.
Back in the old days in Oregon, kids that went to school were let out of school at strawberry season, and they picked strawberries, they picked beans. So we had these housewives around that had grown up picking, and we tapped into that labor source. But that was the end of that generation. I mean, after that, no one was interested anymore.
Right.
And so that's when the Hispanic guys came on board. And you have that, I don't know what it is, that Oregon spirit of you got to do something with the land. You can't ignore it.
Right. One of the things that I realized numerically is that 6 of the first 10 wineries in the North Willamette Valley were started people who had emigrated immediately from Northern California.
Yeah.
Why did that happen?
Well, I think we were looking for cool climate situations. I mean, I'd fallen in love with Pinot in California when at a friend's house, the fellow that had all the Cabernets also brought out a bottle of 55 Inglenook Pinot. It was dynamite bottle of wine.
So after you planted this vineyard, your plan was to make wine here.
Exactly.
And you built the building down below here,
Right.
which wasn't necessarily a lavish construction.
No. And then we ended up not being able to get any significant water. So we abandoned that, and that's about the same time that my partner, Cal Knudsen, came along, and he needed to have the ground that he bought in the Dundee Hills developed. So we did both vineyards at that time. So I made his wine and my wine, and we soon realized that marketing two different brands as small wineries was an uphill battle. So we combined and made it the Knudsen Erath label.
Yeah. I mean, your first wines were Erath Vineyard.
Correct. Yeah.
How long were you and Cal involved?
Oh, we were partners until 1988.
Wow.
Yeah, long time.
You were clearly first a winemaker, but you obviously had to...
Yeah, you have to have, and the more I got into it, the more I realized is that, it's one thing. It just happens to be the grapes are outside and the winemaker's inside.
And once you had wine, there were a couple other jobs that needed to be done, like selling it.
Selling it.
Whoever thought?
Whoever thought? I remember those days when the card table came out in front of the garage, and on weekends we had a mailing list, and people would come out and they bought wine. Not a lot, but they bought it.
And when would that have started? Do you think that you started setting up a table and selling wine at the...
73, 74.
Really, that early?
Yeah.
Cool.
My first vintage was 72, and that was quite an experience going out trying to sell that in Portland. I remember Pepe's wine shop in Lake Oswego. Pepe told me, I said, I've got some wine. He said, well, Sonny, what kind of fruit and berry are you using? And I had to explain to him this was the real stuff,
And did he immediately buy?
No. I think he was very cautious.
In the beginning, you were a teeny winery like everybody else.
Yeah.
But at some point, you must have made a decision that you wanted to be bigger than where you were starting.
I think the vineyards made that decision for us. There was a lot of acres being planted, and you're not going to be small when you have a lot of fruit. And there was people back then were not buying grapes.
Right. So all of Knudsen's had to be made into wine that you sold.
Yes. And all of this.
And all of this.
Yeah.
So you sort of backed your way into being a larger winery, it sounds like. The business of vineyards, the business of wine, the business of selling wine allowed you to sell the winery. You, by then, had yet a third vineyard, which you kept for a number of years and then sold that. And both of those sales, it seems to me, were very successful. Particularly the sale of the winery, I think, was a demonstration of how important Oregon wine was to companies like Saint Michel that bought it.
Yeah, I think that was. They realized they didn't have any Pinot in their portfolio, and they wanted to have that, and they realized that that's where the consumer was going on red wines. I funded the foundation out of the proceeds.
Okay.
So.
And that foundation has been funding all sorts of projects ever since.
Yeah, that's been another aspect of this whole thing that I never knew would happen to me, that I would be able to have a foundation and give back to the community, to the industry, and it's been pretty gratifying to be able to do that. We've been able. We started off with around $3 million, and we put $1 million back into the industry, and we still have $3 million. So we've been able to, we've done a pretty good job of managing our portfolio.
Nice.
Yeah.
What are some of the projects that were industry projects that you were involved with that involved other people?
Well, the first one that I can remember was Chuck and Dave and I had found out that there was a nursery in southern Oregon near Roseburg that was propagating a lot of grape cuttings, and they were all virus-infected stuff. And we said, we can't let this go out into the industry. So we ended up lobbying the Department of Agriculture to shut it down, and they did. And out of that came all the quarantines and
the quarantine for
after
the state.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the first of the industry things.
Were there other industry efforts together that you were participating in the 70s, do you think?
The legislature was proposing a tax on wine that was going to go to alcoholic rehabilitation. And so we said, okay, we want a tax on wine to help develop the industry. And that came through the tax on the grapes. It started out at $15 a ton, I think.
$12.50, I think.
$12.50, and it's up
Table
to
Wine Research Advisory Board.
Yeah, and I was president of that for the first 4 years, and then it became Wine Advisory Board.
Yeah. So this is Clone 95, which has a long and tortured history. This is something you were responsible for.
True. And I got the clone from an acquaintance who had been skiing in Switzerland, stopped back through Burgundy on the way to catch a plane in Paris, and goes by Clos Vougeot, and they're pruning at the time, and right by the big stone gate, as you're right at the entry, there's brush laying on the ground. He asks, "What are you going to do with this?" And they say, "Well, we're going to burn it." He says, "Can I have some?" And they, "Sure." And he stuffs several cuttings in his trench coat, gives them to me, and I got scared to death because of virus problems. So I sent him down to Austin Goheen at Davis. I said, "Austin, clean this stuff up for me." He says, "Yeah, send me $200 and we'll clean it up." Then he retires, and I thought, this is the end of it. And then in 2002 or 2004, I get a note from this, says, "Dear Mr. Erath, your vines are ready." This is like, some 20 some odd years later.
So this vineyard, which you bought in 68.
Bought it 68, planted in 69.
69. And you sold it when you got divorced or soon after that.
Yeah.
What year was that?
88.
88?
87, I think we sold this 87. I think the last crop I took off here was in 87.
Who bought this from you?
That was just a farmer from Idaho and his sons.
Oh, okay.
And then, what was it? I can't remember his name now.
Yeah, and they kept it until like 2015 or something.
Yeah, when she bought it then. Yeah.
When Judy George bought it.
Judy George.
Yeah. You've done a lot of interviews over the years, and I suspect that this is a compliment, hopefully, to the other things that are on record. You also commissioned a book called The Boys Up North for, what was that commissioned for?
That was done from our marketing company, and that was done in '97. The Boys Up North, and there's some, elements of history in there, of my history and other wineries in there.
And for the longest time, it was the only history that told the story of the founding of the industry, really.
Okay.
Obviously, a certain amount of it was through your life, but there was a chapter on me and a chapter on each of these people. What did The Boys Up North, what was that title?
That title came from Richard Summers. He suggested it.
When you bought this piece, started planting, Chuck Query and David Lett had already done that, and there was a every year, every other year, there was somebody doing that. In those days, it wasn't a huge horde. There were only 10 of us in the North Willamette Valley that made wine before 1980. But as people started to follow your dream, did you feel like you were being, that you needed to be protective of that, or that it was more important to share it?
Oh, never thought about protecting it, always thought about, sharing it. Those of us that started were really blessed that we could be here at that time and actually be in on a new industry in a new part of the world. There was nothing here before.
Right.
How you couldn't, there was no standard of identity for an Oregon wine.
How important was creating an industry to you?
I think it ranks right up on top there. I think I got that impression from Chuck, who he always thought that way, and then Cal thought that way too.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Now, 52 years after you bought this piece of property, and probably your formal entry into the Oregon wine business.
Yeah, formal. 52 years.
52 years. How's it turned out?
Beyond my expectations. I mean, I don't think we ever thought that we were going to fail. That never occurred to us. But we never, I don't think we ever thought the degree of success we would have. It's like much greater than I would have imagined.
Thanks for this today.
Oh, you're welcome.
I really appreciate you taking the time and bringing bottles of wine.
Yeah.